Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Today we look at Donald Neilson, aka the Black Panther, who is now an infamous British armed robber and murderer that spans over from 1974 to 1975. Donald Neilson, born Donald Nappy, born on the 1st of August 1936, died on the 18th of December 2011, alias the Black Panther, was a British armed robber, kidnapper and multiple murderer. Mr. Neilson murdered 3 men during the robberies of sub-post offices between 1971 and 1974 and murdered kidnapped victim Leslie Whittle, an heiress from Highway, Shropshire in January 1975. Mr. Neilson was apprehended later that year and sentenced to life imprisonment in July 1976, remaining in prison until his death in 2011. Donald Nappy was aged 10 in January 1947 when his 33-year-old mother died from breast cancer. Mr. Neilson was said to have an unhappy childhood and was caught shopbreaking in 1948, but due to his age and circumstances was given a police caution or a stern warning, and went on to get married to 20-year-old Irene Tate in April 1955 at the age of 18. Mr. Neilson's wife persuaded him to leave the army, where he was serving as a national serviceman in King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry. 4 years after Mr. Neilson's daughter's birth, Nappy changed the family name to Neilson, so that the little girl would not suffer the bullying and abuse Donald had endured at school and in the army because of his surname's similarity to the word nappy. According to David Bell and Harry Hawks, Nappy bought a taxi business from a man named Mr. Neilson and decided to use that name instead of the former. An alternative theory, proposed by a lodger, Lena Fernley, who stayed with the Neilson family in the early 1960s, is that Donald took the name from an ice cream van from which he and Irene bought ice cream for their daughter. Lena Fernley told the BBC in an interview that Donald had told her, "I like that name." Mr. Neilson committed over 400 house robberies without detection during his early days of committing crimes. Before Mr. Neilson became notorious as the Black Panther, Mr. Neilson was sought under a variety of nicknames such as the Phantom and Handy Andy. To confuse the police, Mr. Neilson adopted a different modus operandi every few weeks. For example, Mr. Neilson would steal a radio from each house and abandon it nearby. When that pattern of behaviour was established, Mr. Neilson would then drop it and do something else. Proceeds from simple housebreaking were low. However, after stealing guns and ammunition from a house in Cheshire, Mr. Neilson upped his criminal activity, turning to small post offices. Mr. Neilson committed 18 such crimes between 1971 and 1974. Leslie Richardson, the postmaster, and his wife woke up to find a hooded man in their bedroom. Mr. Richardson leaped out of bed to tackle the intruder while his wife phoned the police. During the struggle, Mr. Neilson showed Mr. Richardson his sawn-off shotgun and said, in a fake West Indian accent, "This is loaded." Mr. Richardson saw the gun was pointing at the ceiling and there was no danger of anyone being shot. Mr. Richardson responded, "We'll find out if it's loaded," and pulled the trigger himself, blasting 2 holes in the ceiling. The fight continued and Mr. Richardson pulled off Mr. Neilson's black hood. Mr. Neilson stomped on Mr. Richardson's feet, breaking several toes and kneed him in the groin. As Mr. Richardson collapsed on the floor, Mr. Neilson made his escape empty-handed. Mr. Richardson gave a police description of his masked intruder, which turned out to be inaccurate in many respects. Several other photo fits of Mr. Neilson were similarly unhelpful to the police, but one, made by sub-postmistress Margaret Grayland, was extremely accurate. Mr. Neilson committed his first 3 murders in 1974. During post office robberies, Mr. Neilson shot dead 2 sub-postmasters and the husband of sub-postmistress, as well as brutally battering sub-postmistress Margaret Grayland. Mr. Neilson killed Donald Skepper in Harrogate in February 1974, Derek Austin of Baxenden in September 1974, and Sidney Grayland in Langley, West Midlands during November 1974. The Baxenden murders resulted in Mr. Neilson being called the Black Panther, as, during an interview with local television reporter, Mr. Astin's wife, Marion, described her husband's killer as so quick he was like a panther. Alluding to the killer's dark clothing, the enterprising reporter ended his piece by asking, "Where is the Black Panther?" and the nickname stuck from then on. Mr. Nielsen was linked to the post office shootings after he shot security guard Gerald Smith 6 times while checking a ransom trial. Forensic examination showed the bullets were fired from the same .22 LR pistol used to murder both Mr. Astin and Mr. Grayland. Leslie Whittle, born 1975, later dying on the 14th of January 1975, was a 17-year-old girl. She became Mr. Nielsen's youngest victim. Mr. Whittle was the daughter of noted coach transport business owner George Whittle and his mistress. Mr. Whittle had left his entire fortune to his mistress and their children, Ronald and Leslie Jr. After reading about a family dispute over George Whittle's will, Mr. Nielsen planned for 3 years to gain some of this fortune for himself. On the 14th of January 1975, Mr. Nielsen entered the Whittle family home in Highley, Shropshire, and kidnapped Mrs. Leslie from her bedroom. Mr. Nielsen calculated that the family would not miss £50,000 of their fortune, and so a subsequent demand for that sum in a note left at the family home. A series of police bundles and other circumstances resulted in Mr. Whittle's brother, Ronald, being unable to deliver the ransom money to the place at the time demanded by the kidnapper, Mr. Nielsen. Leslie Whittle's body was later found on the 7th of March 1975, hanging from a wire at the bottom of the drainage shaft where Mrs. Whittle had tethered her in Blackpool Park at Kids Grove, Staffordshire. The subsequent post-mortem examination showed that Mrs. Whittle had died from vaginal inhibition, not from strangulation. The shock of the fall had caused Mrs. Whittle's heart to stop dead. Some analysts thought it was possible Mr. Nielsen pushed Mrs. Whittle off the ledge where Mr. Nielsen had kept Mrs. Whittle. An alternative scenario is that Mr. Nielsen was not present when Mrs. Whittle died, and that Mr. Nielsen had panicked and fled on the night of the failed ransom collection without returning to the shaft, believing the police were closing in on it. Mrs. Whittle may have lived in the dark for a considerable period of time before she fell to her death. The pathologist noted that Mrs. Whittle weighed only 98 pounds when found. Her stomach and intestines were completely empty. Mrs. Whittle had lost a considerable amount of weight and was emaciated. The pathologist concluded that Mrs. Whittle had not eaten for a minimum of 3 days, the length of time it takes for food to pass through the body, but said the actual duration may have been much, much longer. In his closing speech for the defence, Gilbert Gray QC described the conditions that Mr. Nielsen provided for Miss Whittle, noting ways that Mr. Nielsen tried to provide for Miss Whittle's comfort. For instance, Mr. Gray asked the jury whether they believed any hangman's noose would be padded and lagged with 77.5 inches of elastoplast to avoid chafing, or that any scaffold would be cushioned for comfort by a rubber mattress and sleeping bags. Mr. Gray QC noted that Mrs. Whittle would not have died if the wire had not snagged on a stanchion, because Mr. Whittle's feet were only 6 inches from the bottom of the shaft. The QC said, "This is not something the defence has made up." Mrs. Whittle's height from the neck was 4 feet, and there was 5 feet length of ligature, giving an overall length of 9 feet. The drop from the landing to the floor of the tunnel was 6 feet 11 inches, so that, if it had not been for the unforeseen snagging, which shortened the tether, there would have been 2 feet to spare, and she would have landed on her feet at the bottom of the shaft. Mr. Gray QC asked the jury why Mr. Nielsen bothered to keep her alive once he had recorded the ransom messages, saying he could have simply clubbed her to death and hidden the body in Whittle. Mr. Gray finished his speech by saying, "I submit that when Leslie Whittle went over the platform, it was an unlooked for misadventure, unplanned and undesired. Mr. Nielsen started something that went hideously wrong." In December 1975, 2 police officers, Tony White and Stuart Mackenzie, were in Panther car in a side road keeping a watch on the main A60 trunk road leading out of Mainsfield in North Nottinghamshire, when they spotted a small wiry man passing who was carrying a holdall. As this small wiry man passed the police car, he averted his face, drawing Mr. Mackenzie's attention. As a matter of routine, they called the man over to question him, not knowing who they were dealing with. The man said he was only on his way back from work, then produced a sawn-off shotgun from the holdall. He ordered Mr. White into the back of their car, Mr. Mackenzie's armpit. The policeman opened the car door, but the gunman snapped, "No time for that. Climb the seat." The officer did so, and the gunman settled into the passenger seat, jamming the gun into Mackenzie's arms. The gunman ordered them to drive to Rainsworth, 6 miles away, and told them not to look at him. This presented Mr. Mackenzie with a problem. Gently, Mr. Mackenzie explained to the gunman that they were going the wrong way and he would have to turn the car around. The gunman agreed, but warned both officers if there were any tricks, they would both be dead. As they were driving along Southwell Road, the gunman asked if they had any rope in the vehicle. As Mr. White pretended to look, Mr. Mackenzie reached a junction in the road. Turning the steering wheel, finally one way then the other, Mr. Mackenzie asked, "Which way? Left or right?" causing the gunman to look towards the road. Mr. White saw the gun drop a few inches and realised this was his chance. Mr. White pushed the gun forwards and Mr. Mackenzie stamped on the brake to slow the vehicle and bring it to a stop. They screeched to a halt outside the Junction Chip Shop in Rainsworth. The gun went off, luckily only grazing Mr. White's hand. Mr. Mackenzie fell out of the driver's seat, banging his head on the road. Mr. Mackenzie staggered to his feet and ran towards the fish and chip shop, screaming for help. Two men, Roy Morris and Keith Wood, ran from the queue outside the chip shop and helped to overpower the unknown, armed gunman. Mr. Wood subdued the gunman with a blow to the neck before Mr. Morris grabbed his wrists and held them for Mr. White to snap on the handcuffs. It was later found out that the armed gunman was Donald Neilson. The locals attacked Mr. Neilson so severely in the end that the police had to protect him. They hauled Mr. Neilson to an iron railings at the side of the bus stop and handcuffed him there before calling for backup. In the subsequent investigation, Mr. Neils's fingerprints were found to match one of those in the drain shaft. In the interview at Kids Grove Police Station, when Mr. Neilson confessed to the kidnapping of Mrs. Whittle, Mr. Neilson gave an 18-page statement to DCS Harold Wright, head of Staffordshire CID, and Commander Morrison of Scotland Yard, with the statement handwritten by DCI Walter Bohr. During Mr. Neilson's trial at Oxford Crown Court, his defence lawyer, Gilbert Gray QC, contended that Mrs. Whittle had accidentally fallen from a ledge and had died as a result. Mr. Gray noted that Mr. Neilson had fed her chicken soup, spaghetti and meatballs, and bought her fish and chips, chicken legs and polo mint. The prosecution contested these claims. Evidence showed that Mr. Neilson had provided his victim with a sleeping bag designed to prevent hypothermia, mattresses, survival blankets, survival bags, a bottle of brandy, 6 paperback books, a copy of the Times, and 2 magazines for reading, a small puzzle, and 2 brightly coloured naps. These items were found in the shaft and in the subterranean canal running below it by the police. In July 1976, Mr. Neilson was convicted of the kidnapping and murder of Leslie Whittle, for which he was given a life sentence. 3 weeks later, Mr. Neilson was convicted of the murders of 2 postmakers and the husband of a postmistress. In total, Mr. Neilson received a total of 5 life sentences. The judge, Mr. Justice Miles Jones, also gave Mr. Neilson a further 61 years, 21 years for kidnapping, and 10 years for blackmailing her mother. 3 further sentences of 10 years each were imposed for 2 of the burglary charges Mr. Neilson stole guns and ammunition from, and for possessing the sawn-off shotgun with intent to endanger life. All the sentences were to run concurrently. The judge told Mr. Neilson that the enormity of his crimes put him in a class apart from almost all other convicted murderers in recent years. Mr. Neilson's defence team, Solicitor Barrington Black, Junior Counsel Norman Jones, and Leading Counsel Gilbert Gray all claimed that Mr. Neilson's conviction was a reflection of public opinion, a backlash of the publicity given to the hunt for the kidnapper and killer of that Mr. Neilson should have been convicted only on the lesser charge of manslaughter. Mr. Neilson was acquitted of attempted murders of sub-postmistresses Margaret Grayland and PC Tony White, but found guilty of lesser alternative charges of inflicting grievous bodily harm on Mrs. Grayland and of possessing a shotgun with the intent of endangering life at Mr. Mansfield. A charge of attempted to murder security guard Gerald Smith, whom Mr. Neilson shot 6 times while checking the Mrs. Whittle ransom trail, was not pursued due to legal complications. Mr. Smith died more than a year and a day after being shot. The trial judge recommended that Mr. Neilson receive a whole life tariff. After the verdicts, Mr. Gray visited his client in a cell below the courthouse and found Mr. Neilson in a corner of his cell, curled up in a fetal position. Purportedly dejected and allegedly filled with remorse, Mr. Whittle and her family. According to Harry Hawkes, when Donald Neilson was first caught in Mansfield, his wife Irene became worried when Mr. Neilson failed to return home. Irene burned around 50 postal orders in their coal fire. Police noticed the charred remains within the chimney when the house was later searched. Irene Neilson was later convicted of cashing over 80 stolen postal orders, stolen in one of her husband's post office raids. Mr. Neilson claimed to have been forced into cashing these items in various post offices over a large area. Her solicitor, Barrington Black, placed the blame squarely on Donald Nielsen's complete domination of his wife, describing Mr. Nielsen as a Svengali who had exercised a hypnotic influence. He added he was a quasi-military figure who barked orders at his wife and daughter, and woe betide anyone who betrayed him, who disobeyed him. The solicitor said he felt this portrayal was confirmed by Donald Nielsen when he had visited him in his top security cell. It seemed a formality that Irene, then aged 42 with no previous convictions, would be placed on probation. It seemed a formality that Irene, then aged 42 with no previous convictions, would be placed on probation, but a court report said that the probation would not be suitable. Black pressed hard for Irene Nielsen to be fined, asking the magistrates if she really deserved to be harshly treated for a situation that was forced upon her, and saying her last 3 years with Mr. Nielsen before his arrest had been simply hell. The magistrates said that while they had every sympathy with the lady before the courts for the first time, they regarded Mr. Nielsen's activities as a deliberate course of misconduct. Mr. Nielsen received 12 months in prison per official court records. An appeal was immediately lodged. Gilbert Gray QC was briefed to represent Mr. Nielsen, and he produced Donald Nielsen as a surprise witness. The QC told the judge, sitting with 2 magistrates, that he was anxious that the court should be aware of the pressure and constraints placed upon Mrs. Nielsen as a result of her husband. Mr. Gray said Mr. Nielsen was the man who struck fear and dread into pretty much the whole community, and this woman lived with him. But the judges found Donald Nielsen's testimony to have a vagueness, and they upheld his wife's conviction and sentence. While Irene was in prison, a major newspaper paid a large amount of money for Mrs. Nielsen's story. 6 years later, in an interview with the Sunday People, Irene Nielsen claimed that she doubted she would have been jailed had she not been Mr. Nielsen's wife. Mr. Nielsen said everyone had wanted blood after her husband's trial. In the event that Mrs. Nielsen served 8 months before being released, with full remission for good behaviour. Following subsequent legal judgments in various other cases and the implications of European Union human rights laws, Mr. Nielsen was confirmed on numerous occasions to be the one on the Home Office's list of prisoners with whole life tariffs. A succession of Home Secretaries ruled that the life should remain life for Mr. Nielsen. In 2008, Mr. Nielsen applied to the High Court to have his minimum term reverted to just 30 years. On the 12th of June 2008, Mr. Justice Thiers upheld the whole life tariff, saying this is a case where the gravity of the applicant's offences justifies a whole life order. The manner in which the young girl was killed demonstrates that it too involved a substantial degree of premeditation or planning. It also involved the abduction of the young girl. The location and manner of Leslie Whittle's death indicate that she must have been subsequent by the applicant to a dreadful and horrific ordeal. In the early hours on the 17th of December 2011, Mr. Nielsen was taken from Norwich Prison to Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital with breathing difficulties. Mr. Nielsen was pronounced dead the next day on the 18th of December 2011. Mr. Nielsen's life and crimes were portrayed in the 1977 film The Black Panther, starring Donald Sumster as Donald Nielsen. It was released on DVD in 2012. A fictionalized account of Mrs. Whittle's kidnapping and Mr. Nielsen's trial forms the basis of Adam Mars Jones's short story, Bathpool Park, which attempted to show how the court and judge had missed the point. Mars Jones's father, Sir William Mars Jones, presided over the trial, and Adam Mars Jones served as his father's marshal. So what are your thoughts and opinions of the complexity and tragic life story and childhood that Donald Nielsen had to deal with on a daily basis? Please let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.